Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference channel. My name is Jesse Dane. We're counting down to the next VRIC, January 21st and 22nd, 2024. Link to tickets is in the description below. And today's guest is the author of the #1 financial Substack, where he writes about energy, finance, and the economy at large. Somebody I always love talking to. It's Doomberg. Welcome to the show.
Jesse, great to be back with you. Congratulations on the new channel. It's always fun to watch your success, and it's a real privilege to be with you here today. Looking forward to a fantastic discussion.
Well, thank you, my friend. And I want to start with a fantastic article that you recently wrote called You're Next. And this was about the debanking of Nigel Farage in the UK. You know, in the article, you mentioned you've been noticing a drift towards totalitarianism in a lot of Western countries. And this seems to be another sign of that. You know, Nigel Farage did not have any due process. There was no accusation that was out in the public that he had a chance to answer for. He was just quietly debanked and denied banking services. And as you mentioned in a previous interview I saw you in, that it doesn't really matter what political side of the aisle you're on. This should concern you. We obviously saw Justin Trudeau freezing bank accounts in Canada of political dissidents. And this seems like a sort of weapon of control for the political class. So how far do you see this going, and how worried do you think your average citizen should be?
I think it's gone much, much further than the average citizen realizes. I think the fallout from Nigel Farage coming public has been pretty remarkable. Thousands of people in the UK coming forward with similar stories of having their bank accounts randomly closed without explanation, oftentimes for nothing more than having expressed a political view. This is very, very dangerous territory. As you mentioned, we've been writing about this for some time. And in fact, we began down this road of pulling the string on the debanking of otherwise unaccused and innocent citizens for political thought all the way back in the Canadian trucker days. We wrote a piece called Just Watch Me, where we compared Justin Trudeau's behavior and charisma to his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was a legendary politician in Canada. And the way in which his father handled the Quebec crisis, terrorism back in the day, and we think Justin Trudeau's behavior in that episode was shameful and won't be treated kindly by historians. And then it continued. Nobody would accuse us of being crypto fans. We've written quite skeptically about crypto, which we're always careful to differentiate from Bitcoin. But we wrote a couple of pieces highlighting that some of the tactics being deployed to shut down the crypto industry should give people significant pause. We wrote a piece called Pandora's Precedent, which opened with a story of how U.S. prosecutors basically used illegal tactics to shut down the online poker industry back in the day. And we happen, by coincidence, to have had a good friend who was caught up in that dragnet, never charged with a crime, but had his life destroyed, had his wealth basically confiscated from him, and still to this day is losing bank accounts merely because he has been associated with online poker. And then now with crypto, very similarly, if you have crypto in your name, you know, of your business, or if you're any way associated with that industry in a high profile manner, you too should be looking over your shoulder. Banks have decided, or have been told more correctly from regulators, that this is the entire sector should be debanked. And I suspect that in the coming months, we'll hear crypto businesses that are not doing anything wrong. There's legitimate technologies in the space for sure. There's obviously a lot of fraud as well. And so we've been pretty ideologically consistent, regardless of who the underlying actors are that are suffering from this extrajudicial punishment from the government without even an accusation to defend themselves against, as you have implied. And here too, if you read Your Next and you think this is a piece about Nigel Farage, you have missed the point.
So how can your average citizen protect themselves from this sort of debanking scenario? Is it important to hold some form of wealth outside the financial system, whether that be physical precious metals or Bitcoin? Should people be withdrawing a certain amount of actual physical cash to be holding on to outside of the banking system? Are there any other steps that people can take to reduce the risk of being locked out of the traditional financial system?
To be totally honest with you, Jesse, unless you're in possession of a second passport and you are willing to leave the country, as Nigel Farage has claimed that he might have to ponder doing, we really don't see any effective way that an individual can protect themselves or hedge against this kind of hegemony, which is precisely why it should cause everybody listening to stand up and to get politically active about it. Look, if you own gold, American Gold Eagles, let's say, a stack of them in your safe in the basement, and suddenly you don't have a bank account, good luck converting that into cash that you could use to spend. And even if you could, good luck using that cash, because as we all know, there's a war on cash, and less businesses are willing to accept cash for payment in return for goods and services. Same thing with Bitcoin. If you can't have access to the payment rails, your Bitcoin is a reasonably good store of value, just like your gold eagles are, but you won't be able to use them until you have access to banking. Physical cash itself, as I mentioned, the three options that you sort of laid out. None of these work sustainably. If the government decides to debank you, they are punishing you with a very severe restriction on the quality of your life. You become an unperson in modern society. Look, if this was 1940, 1950, where 90% plus of the transactions were done in cash and debit cards and Visa cards weren't even invented yet, that's a whole different story. Today, you literally can't use cash. And if you can have your ability to persist in our society revoked from you without even an accusation, just because a banker has been instructed by a regulator that you are, quote, a high-risk individual. That is the literal definition of totalitarianism. And by the way, the consequence of this is far too few people will be willing to speak out about it, like you and I are, because they think to themselves, this is highly unlikely to happen to me if I just keep my mouth shut, and they go about their business. We decided to write that piece, and look, it's a very real threat to us. We have written critically about the proposed solutions to the climate agenda, for example. How far away are we from the censorship industrial complex, as our friend Michael Schellenberger likes to call it, ejecting the Doomberg team from the financial system because we write critically about the climate agenda. We are expressing well thought out, well resourced, well cited research and opinion. We do so authentically. We write what we believe. We're not spreading misinformation or disinformation for some illicit political purpose. We are trying to participate in a legitimate political discussion. And in so doing, we know that if the trend continues, we'll be next. And that's why we wrote the piece, You're Next, because on the path from Nigel to you is us. And once they're done with us, they'll get about the task of getting on to you. And so the only thing that people can do that are listening, in our view, that is effective, is to get involved politically, to stop it in its tracks, to lobby their politicians. And that's what we're trying to do in our own very small way, is to leverage the platform that we have worked so hard to build for this really important task, which is why that piece, You're Next, was made free to the entire public.
Yes, and I will put a link to that in the description below so people can check it out. I highly recommend they do. And speaking about being denied access to banking, a lot of people point to the fact of US and other nations seizing Russian FX reserves as the reason or one of the catalysts for why the BRICS nations now seem to be set on launching a new form of currency, probably backed by gold. We haven't had a 100% confirmation of exactly what's going on. There will be a meeting in August where people are expecting a full announcement to be made. How impactful do you think this currency could be? Because I know you're currently working on a piece about it. It will be out by the time this interview goes live. So, in your own research, what are some things that have stood out to you, and how do you think this whole thing will unfold?
I would say that we are observing the developments with significant interest. There are lots of reasons to potentially think this might be a transformative event for gold and the price of gold, which is what people who are interested in this subject are really talking about. And the story goes something like this. The BRICS, having seen what happens when a country steps out of line vis-a-vis how the US believes it should behave, they are at risk of losing their reserves. And the world needs, as this narrative goes, a neutral reserve asset to basically replace US treasuries and other Western government debt, because the G7 has proven that they're willing to effectively default on that debt for political purposes. And that's exactly what happened. Like when we seized Russian reserves, we have defaulted on an obligation to a foreign entity. And even though the credit default swaps have never paid out, and we don't see any discussion in that regard, it would seem to be a classic definition of a default to our eye. And so the search for a neutral reserve asset, understandably, settles on gold. The total market value of gold is probably insufficient for it to serve the role of a neutral reserve asset and sort of a balance of payments mechanism in international trade. And so the view is that if a very large currency were to become gold-backed once again, then the physical market would once again dominate the price of gold as opposed to the paper market, which many gold enthusiasts believe is artificially suppressing the price of gold today. And so our piece goes into that history, into that background. And then we actually found 5 experts that we know that are also content creators, many of them writers, some of them on Substack, and they fed us their views, the pros, the cons, the risks, the likelihoods, the impact on gold. And we just summarized everybody else's views, adding our own commentary. And in the end, we concluded that for us, whether or not the BRICS currency evolves and whether or not it is backed by gold doesn't really change the reason why we own gold. And we don't own gold to speculate. I've mentioned on other podcasts that our financial strategy involves earning money in fiat, saving money by buying real assets like gold and land and collectibles, and then investing privately where we can affect the outcome. None of this changes that prism. And we don't own gold to speculate. We own gold as a place to park our excess earnings in the form of savings. And we are watching with great interest. We are keen as sort of historians and people who chronicle the ongoing history that we're making every day. It certainly would be a monumental event. But if you're asking me whether the U.S. is just going to stand aside and allow this to happen and the price of gold is going to go to 10,000 because of it, we would be dubious towards that line of thinking.
What's up, guys? Quick break. My name is Jay Martin. I'm the CEO of Cambridge House and the host of the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference. I wanted to quickly point your attention to a link right beneath this video where you can subscribe to our new weekly newsletter. If you want to better understand the minds of the best investors in the resource space, subscribe to this newsletter. I author it personally every Sunday and I love writing it. Hit that link below to subscribe. All right, back to the interview.
So I know the Doomberg team spends a lot of time looking at history, as you've just mentioned, as well as politics and geopolitics. And it seems right now we're in a very precarious time politically and geopolitically, with people on either side of the aisle unwilling to give an inch and getting more radical in their views. Are you seeing that sort of thing occurring as well? And if so, is this just a cycle that humanity goes through every now and again? And could we perhaps see light on the other side of it?
I think we're in a very precarious time. I think if you had said 5 years ago that there would be a hot proxy war between the US and Russia on the borders of Russia, creeping into what many consider to be Europe today, with talk of exploding nuclear power plants and long-range missiles being positioned and more countries joining NATO, people would have thought, wow, that is a historic development. Now you add into that ever increasing tensions between China and the US with regards to the Taiwan situation, the economic war that has been brewing between those two superpowers as well, and the prospect of basically 3 of the largest nuclear powers in the world in a conflict. That's actually, I think, quite a historically significant series of events. And, when we look back at history, we think about World War II starting when, Germany invaded Poland. But in fact, throughout the late 1930s, there were a whole series of global conflicts. Japan, China comes to mind as obviously a pretty significant one. Germany was arming. There was a series of, near conflict events that were ultimately settled, and then those settlements were reneged upon, as everyone knows. But I don't think at the time that people pondered that they weren't in World War II, when in fact they might have been in the late 30s, right? And it does have a certain similar feel here, except of course the consequences of a global conflict of this type back then did not include the direct existential threat of all humanity in a thermonuclear conflict like we have dangling over us today. I think it's kind of a Pascal's wager situation for the average citizen. They don't want to think about it. Why bet for it? Because, I'm reminded of Jim Cramer back in the day. For as much as he's become a meme now, he said something on television that stuck with me. He said he's always bought every nuclear war dip because if he's wrong, it doesn't matter. And so I do think there's a certain set of mindset like that where people are just keeping it out of mind because if it does escalate, what does it matter? We'll all be dead anyway.
Right. Very succinctly said. I want to shift over to energy now, because I know that's also something you focus on a lot. And green energy, particularly wind energy at this point, because we've seen Siemens energy stock plummet by roughly 37% as costly failures in relation to wind turbines seem to leave investors in doubt. This seems to be a problem across the industry. The level of maintenance and repair needed to keep these wind turbines running is massive. A lot of it was paid for with government subsidies. And do you think wind energy is actually a viable option at this point? Or do you think it will eventually be abandoned altogether once reality sets in?
Much less so than solar. We do think that wind energy is the weakest link of the renewable options available to us. And if you pressed me to make a bet a decade from now, I think we will look back on the folly of the hundreds of billions of dollars we've spent in the wind sector as one of the great blunders of history. There's a fundamental challenge that plagues wind technology. It's low energy density. Wind is dispersed, and to harvest it economically, you need to put in a significant amount of energy because you have to make extraordinarily long and tough blades that can survive enormous, environmental challenges as it tries to set about the task of creating energy from the wind. These blades convert kinetic energy into rotational energy, which is then used, usually fed into a gearbox and so on. And then it produces electricity, and then that electricity has to be, sent over long distance to where it's ultimately used. We're seeing today blade failures. We're seeing gearbox failures. We're seeing erosion for offshore wind at speeds much faster than engineers had originally modeled. Our test here is very simple. If wind were so cheap, it wouldn't need the massive amount of subsidies, and it wouldn't be the case that nobody in the industry is making any money. As you correctly pointed out, integrated over the life of these projects are destroying shareholder value. And on top of all of that, wind actually doesn't displace the capacity of baseload power that you need to maintain on standby, because you could go from producing too much electricity from wind to producing none in the span of a day. And we see that playing out, especially in Europe and in the UK and in Germany during the doldrums. This is not a viable technology in our view. At least solar is far more predictable and has far less material science challenges involved. And we do think that ultimately wind is headed down a very bad path.
So, what role do you think traditional fossil fuels are going to play in the energy ecosystem? They're obviously hated by the elite political class. You've got environmental activists saying just stop oil, which is insane. A lot of them are calling to stop oil now, which would collapse civilization and plunge everybody into the dark age, not to mention cause mass death and starvation across the developing world and perhaps even beyond. But how do you view maybe the more dirtier fossil fuel side of things, such as coal, where we are seeing coal use ramp up in India, in China, in Pakistan, in places like that, as well as oil and natural gas? What role do they have to play in the energy ecosystem in the years ahead?
So we wrote a piece called Got Milk a few weeks ago, where we developed what we've since called Doomberg's postulate. And Doomberg's postulate goes like this. Every molecule of fossil fuels produced worldwide will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local efforts to restrict consumption merely relocate the enjoyment of that privilege. It is just undeniable that the developing world, the global south, the non-aligned countries, however you would like to refer to them, will happily and greedily consume every pound of coal, every gallon of oil, every BTU of natural gas that the West, quote, saves by the sacrifices that it is imposing upon its population. There will be no spare oil capacity cushion. There's only a temporary lag between the presentation of energy abundance and the time it takes market forces to reorient it. This is, of course, because energy is life. And all humans everywhere want a higher standard of living, which means all humans everywhere will consume as much affordable energy as they are allocated. And the 4 to 5 billion people in the global south are not going to be denied. And who are we to deny them their rightful endeavor as humans, which is to progress, to improve, to gain comfort, to climb Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to provide for themselves and their family and their friends and their communities. And this is just how it's going to be. And so if you want to know how many carbon emissions we're going to have, all you really have to do is measure production, because every pound of it, every molecule of it is going to be used by somebody somewhere.
Interesting point of view, and that does make a lot of sense. I do want to talk about nuclear energy here. We've obviously seen Germany shut down nuclear reactors, which ironically led to them ramping up the use of lignite coal. There's a few other outliers, but for the most part, countries are embracing nuclear energy. You know, it's being labeled as a green form of energy. Even the eco-friendly green crowd seems to be embracing it these days. There's very little environmental activism against nuclear, and what is out there seems to be getting ridiculed more and more, which is great to see. Can you talk to us about how you see the nuclear industry developing and also the advent of small modular reactor technology and how that could increase the use of nuclear energy worldwide?
Two-part answer for you. To the first question, even Justin Trudeau, and as we mentioned earlier, we're no fans of his, has come around to the concept that there is no path to meaningful decarbonization that doesn't go right through nuclear power, that at least doesn't involve a complete destruction of our way of life. And as we're seeing in Germany, the population will not put up with a complete destruction of their way of life. We're beginning to see severe political pushback in Germany, populist parties emerging to the front of the pack, and we'll be keeping a close eye on German politics in the months ahead as the extent of the deindustrialization that has occurred and is occurring dawns on the local population, and they ponder the sheer folly of the policies that have been imposed upon them from their green elites. Around the world, outside of Germany, we're seeing a total renaissance. United Arab Emirates just had its third reactor come online. Canada, with its CANDU technology, is going full speed ahead. Even the US is pushing. Japan is re-engaging with nuclear power. Even Belgium, who had been previously as anti-nuclear as Germany, seems to be reversing course. So we believe the secular trends for nuclear fission and uranium are quite bullish. To your second question, the power of SMRs. SMRs bring fascinating suite of optionality to our desire to abate carbon, in that a fourth generation nuclear technology is capable of producing reasonably useful industrial grade steam. And we wrote about this in a piece called Gaining Steam, where we described an interesting project between Dow and X Energy, where they're going to use small modular reactor technology to create a cogeneration plant inside the fence line of one of their petrochemical facilities. For those that don't know, cogeneration facilities are very popular in industry because you need both steam and electricity to run such interconnected complex sites. And traditionally, natural gas is used as the main fuel for cogen facilities. Here, you can replace natural gas and still have a reasonable amount of high-grade steam. And this is important because the production of steam actually accounts for more of our global carbon emissions than the transportation sector combined, i.e., passenger vehicles and aviation. And the amount of airtime that electric vehicles get pales in comparison to the amount of airtime replacing steam with carbon-free technology gets. And those things can't be done with solar nor wind. They can only be done with nuclear. And that slug of our emissions is ripe for disruption. And one of the reasons why SMR technology is particularly attractive is because the sort of the radius of safety around such facilities is much smaller than a traditional, old generation large modular reactor, and can easily fit within the fence line of such industrial facilities where there already is a high degree of security, cameras, controlled access, and so on. And these companies, obviously, since they run dangerous chemical facilities, are more than capable of running nuclear that has a really incredible track record of safety, even compared to sort of chemical refineries. Barely a month goes by where we don't see a major accident at some refinery somewhere in the world where people die and pollution is let out into the atmosphere. Nuclear, by comparison, is orders of magnitude more safe. Pluck one of those in the middle of one of those facilities, and you could actually make a meaningful impact on our carbon footprint, if that's something that we still desire to do.
So I want to end on climate change, and the cries of the climate change fanatics seem to be getting more and more absurd. You posted on your Twitter recently a Bloomberg headline stating that $200 trillion is a bargain to stop global warming. How serious is climate change here? Because you get people on all sides of the aisle. Obviously, this is something that has gone back quite a while. There's articles that have been posted from the 70s saying that if we don't solve climate change, we're going to be extinct by the 80s or the 90s. And it seems like every certain amount of years, new articles are coming out in the press saying by this date, unless we solve this problem, the waters will rise, islands will sink, catastrophe will happen, and yet it never really does. Is it that the truth lies in the middle? Is climate change just a complete non-issue, or is it something that people need to be concerned about? And what is your view on this climate change fanaticism that's going on these days, and the dangers it could pose?
So we have said publicly and in our writing that we would fade climate alarmism, and that climate alarmism radically underestimates our ability to adapt to a changing climate. And this is done on purpose, of course, to keep the gravy train running. $200 trillion is an awful lot of grift. And we do see an awful lot of grift in the renewable space. And we would also say there's little that the West could do to change the course we're on, because as we mentioned earlier, the global South is going to industrialize. So the choice before us is to have billions less people on the planet currently, or take our chances, roll the dice, and see how able we are to react to the climate as it changes. And we just put a piece out on the end of the drought in California, and at the end of the drought in the Colorado River Basin, and just how quickly that turned around. And the piece was called Wet Blanket. And one of the things we've noticed in the media is that the drought was climate change, and the end of the drought is now also climate change. And one of the things we've said in our piece is everything is climate change, then nothing is. We can celebrate that the water levels at Lake Powell and Lake Mead are beginning to recover, and that California has basically no counties under any meaningful drought, and neither does Colorado. This is okay. And by the way, as we mentioned in the piece, a political adaptation was secured by the Biden administration. To their credit, they negotiated with states in the lower basin of the Colorado River to conserve 3 million acre feet, I believe is the number, over the next 3 years. And in return, they were allocated $1.2 billion of federal funds. Well, if all it cost to make a meaningful dent on the problem was to wait for the weather to change and to pay out $1.2 billion, how does that compare with the hundreds of billions of dollars being earmarked from the Inflation Reduction Act? We would say that while $1.2 billion is a lot of money for you and I, we doubt that federal regulators or federal allocators would bend over to pick up that money if they found it on the sidewalk. It's such an inconsequential sum to the hundreds of billions that they're wasting in this fruitless effort. And it makes one ponder, what exactly are we doing with all this money, when something as big a scale as the drought out west and the subsequent torrential rainfall that has happened and snowpack that occurred this year, if we can handle all of that and get things back mostly to normal with a political solution and $1.2 billion of federal funding, what exactly are we doing with these hundreds of billions of dollars? So we are, of course, very concerned about pollution, about damaging the planet, about ecosystems. I think the scandal of the amount of plastics being dumped into the oceans, especially in Asia, is something that the plastic makers need to be held accountable for, and they're trying their best to try to clean things up. I think we should minimize the emissions of known pollutants. I think the way in which the world came together to close the ozone hole was admirable. Those were not natural products, those fluorocarbons that were doing damage in the atmosphere. That event shows that humans can come together and can make real progress on pollution challenges and on adapting to the climate. And so our view is, since there's not really anything we can do about it anyway, the money we're spending today would best be used to react to the changes in the climate that we don't like. Unfortunately, that is a losing argument. The horse is long gone out of the barn, and there's nothing we can do to stand in the way of the fire hose of cash that is going to be poured onto this problem, except do our best to try to anticipate how the market will react to that and write about those things and prepare our subscribers accordingly.
Great. Well, that's a perfect segue into asking about the Doomberg Substack. For those who want to learn more, could you tell us about that and where to find it?
You bet. So we are at doomberg.substack.com. We write 6 to 8 pieces a month. We're a very small team. Everything that we research, write, publish, and promote comes from this small team. We are 100% subscriber supported. We do not accept ads or sponsorships. And it's not that there's anything wrong with those models. We have just decided that in order to maintain the maximum degree of editorial flexibility and freedom, that we would rather be reader supported. We have been touched and amazed and humbled by the outpouring of support by our many thousands of paying subscribers. So head over to doomberg.substack.com. You'll see some free samples. If you sign up with your email, you'll get the free previews to all of our pieces. And if we do our job well enough, after reading a few of our previews, maybe we can induce you to become a paying subscriber and a full-blown member of the Chicken Coop. Jesse, it was fantastic as always. Congratulations again. I know that the conference is going to be a huge success. Really innovative way to promote it using this podcast, and appreciated the invite, and look forward to chatting you again in the future.
Yes, thank you so much. I will put a link below in the description to the Doomberg Substack for people who want to check that out. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge with our audience.